The Human Cycle by Sri Aurobindo. Chapter 7. The Ideal Law of Social Development. The true law of our development and the entire object of our social existence can only become clear to us when we have discovered not only, like modern science, what man has been in his past physical and vital evolution, but his future mental and spiritual destiny, and his place in the cycles of nature. This is the reason why the subjective periods of human development must always be immeasurably the most fruitful and creative. In the others, he either seizes on some face, image, type of inner reality nature in him is laboring to manifest, or else he follows a mechanical impulse, or shapes himself in the mold of her external influences. But here, in his subjective return inward, he gets back to himself, back to the root of his living and infinite possibilities, and the potentiality of a new and perfect self-creation begins to widen before him. He discovers his real place in nature and opens his eyes to the greatness of his destiny. Existence is an infinite and therefore indefinable and illimitable reality, which figures itself out in multiple values of life. It begins, at least in our field of existence, with a material figure of itself, a mold of firm substance into which and upon which it can build worlds, the earth, the body. Here it stamps firmly and fixes the essential law of its movement. That law is that all things are one in their being and origin, one in their general law of existence, one in their interdependence and the universal pattern of their relations, but each realizes this unity of purpose and being on its own lines, and has its own law of variation by which it enriches the universal existence. In matter, variation is limited. There is variation of type, but on the whole, uniformity of the individuals of the type. These individuals have a separate movement, but yet the same movement. Subject to some minute differences, they adhere to one particular pattern, and have the same assemblage of properties. Variety within the type, apart from minor unicities of detail, is gained by variation of group subtypes, belonging to one general kind, species, and subspecies of the same genus. In the development of life, before mind has become self-conscious, the same law predominates, but in proportion as life grows, and still more when mind emerges, the individual also arrives at a greater and more vital power of variation. he acquires the freedom to develop according, no doubt, to the general law of nature and the general law of his type, but also according to the individual law of his being. Man, the mental being in nature, is especially distinguished from her less developed creatures by a greater power of individuality, by the liberation of the mental consciousness, which enables him finally to understand more and more himself and his law of being and his development, by the liberation of the mental will, which enables him, under the secret control of the universal will, to manage more and more the materials and lines of his development, and by the capacity, in the end, to go beyond himself, beyond his mentality, and open his consciousness into that from which mind, life, and body proceed. He can even, however imperfectly at present, get at his highest to some consciousness of the reality which is his true being, and possess consciously also, as nothing else in terrestrial nature can possess, the self, the idea, the will, which have constituted him, and can become, by that, the master of his own nature, and increasingly, not as now he is, a wrestler with dominant circumstance, but the master of nature. To do this, to arrive through mind and beyond mind at the self, the spirit, which expresses itself in all nature, and, becoming one with it in his being, his force, his consciousness, his will, his knowledge, to possess at once humanly and divinely, according to the law and nature of human existence, but of human existence fulfilled in God, and fulfilling God in the world. Both himself and the world is the destiny of man, and the object of his individual and social existence. Footnote 1. It may be said that since man is a mental being, limited by the mind, life, and body, this development and organization of a power beyond mind, a supramental power, would be the creation of a new superhuman race, and that the use of the words human and humanly would no longer be in place. This is no doubt true, but the possibility for the race still remains, if not for all in the same degree, or at the same time, yet in an eventual fulfillment. This is done primarily through the individual man. For this end, man has become an individual soul, that the one may find and manifest himself in each being. That end is not indeed achieved by the individual human being in his unaided mental force. He needs the help of the secret divine above his mentality in his superconscient self. He needs the help also of the secret divine around him in nature and in his fellow men, everything in nature is an occasion for him to develop his divine potentiality, an occasion which he has a certain relative freedom to use or to misuse, although in the end both his use and misuse of his materials are overruled in their results by the universal will, so as to assist eventually the development of his law of being and his destiny. All life around him is a help towards the divine purpose in him. Every human being is his fellow worker and assists him, whether by association and union or by strife and opposition. Nor does he achieve his destiny as the individual man for the sake of the individual soul alone. A lonely salvation is not his complete ideal, but for the world also, or rather for God in the world. For God in all, as well as above all, and not for God solely and separately in one. And he achieves it by the stress, not really of his separate individual will, but of the universal will in its movement towards the goal of its cycles. The object of all society should be, therefore, and must become, as man grows conscious of his real being, nature and destiny, and not as now only a part of it, first to provide the conditions of life and growth by which individual man, not isolated men or a class or a privileged race, but all individual men according to their capacity, and the race, through the growth of its individuals, may travel towards this divine perfection. It must be, secondly, as mankind generally more and more grows near to some figure of the divine in life, and more men arrive at it. For the cycles are many, and each cycle has its own figure of the divine in man, to express in the general life of mankind the light, the power, the beauty, the harmony, the joy of the self that has been attained, and that pours itself out in a freer and nobler humanity. Freedom and harmony express the two necessary principles of variation and oneness. Freedom of the individual, the group, the race, coordinated harmony of the individual's forces and of the efforts of all individuals in the group, of all groups in the race, of all races in the kind. And these are the two conditions of healthy progression and successful arrival. To realize them and to combine them has been the obscure or half-enlightened effort of mankind throughout its history. A task difficult indeed, and too imperfectly seen, and too clumsily and mechanically pursued by the reason and desires to be satisfactorily achieved until man grows by self-knowledge and self-mastery to the possession of a spiritual and psychical unity with his fellow men. As we realize more and more the right conditions, we shall travel more luminously and spontaneously towards our goal. And as we draw nearer to a clear sight of our goal, we shall realize better and better the right conditions. The self in man, enlarging light and knowledge, and harmonizing will with light and knowledge, so as to fulfill in life what he has seen in his increasing vision and idea of the self. This is man's source and law of progress, and the secret of his impulse towards perfection. Mankind upon earth is one foremost self-expression of the universal being in his cosmic self unfolding. He expresses, under the conditions of the terrestrial world he inhabits, the mental power of the universal existence. All mankind is one in its nature, physical, vital, emotional, mental, and has ever been, in spite of all differences of intellectual development, ranging from the poverty of the Bushman and Negroid to the rich cultures of Asia and Europe. And the whole race has, as the human totality, one destiny, which it seeks and increasingly approaches in the cycles of progression and retrogression it describes through the countless millenniums of its history. Nothing which any individual race or nation can triumphantly realize, no victory of their self-aggrandizement, illumination, intellectual achievement, or mastery over the environment has any permanent meaning or value, except insofar as it adds something, or recovers something, or preserves something for this human march. The purpose which the ancient Indian scripture offers to us as the true object of all human action, Lokasangraha, the holding together of the race in its psychic evolution, is the constant sense, whether we know it or know it not, of the sum of our activities. But within this general nature and general destiny of mankind, each individual human being has to follow the common aim on the lines of his own nature, and to arrive at his possible perfection by a growth from within. So only can the race itself attain to anything profound, living, and deep-rooted. It cannot be done brutally, heavily, mechanically in the mass. The group self has no true right to regard the individual as if he were only a cell of its body, a stone of its edifice, a passive instrument of its collective life and growth. Humanity is not so constituted. We miss the divine reality in man, and the secret of the human birth If we do not see that each individual man is that self and sums up all human potentiality in his own being, that potentiality he has to find, develop, work out from within. No state or legislator or reformer can cut him rigorously into a perfect pattern. No church or priest can give him a mechanical salvation. No order, no class life or ideal, no nation, no civilization or creed or ethical, social, or religious shastra can be allowed to say to him permanently, "In this way of mine, and thus far shalt thou act and grow, and in no other way, and no farther shall thy growth be permitted." These things may help him temporarily, or they may curb, and he grows in proportion as he can use them, and then exceed them, train and teach his individuality by them, but asserted always in the end in its divine freedom. Always he is the traveler of the cycles, and his road is forward. True, his life and growth are for the sake of the world, but he can help the world by his life and growth only in proportion as he can be more and more freely and widely his own self.